This is the earliest photo of Jomo Kenyatta. It was taken when photo shooting was almost unknown. His official date of birth is indicated as 1897, although some claims that he was born much earlier. He was born Kamau wa Muigai. His father was named Muigai and his mother Wamboi. His father kept goats and sheep while practicing farming. Kenyatta took part in herding animals at the farm, which was based near River Thiririka. By all standards, Kenyatta's father's household was considered wealthy. They were. In those days, wealth was measured in terms of the number of goats, sheep, and cattle that one had, together with the number of wives a man had. By the time Kenyatta was born, Kenya had been declared a British protectorate. It was referred to as British Kenya or British East Africa. Meanwhile, the Imperial British East African Company, which was a common association founded to develop Africa trade in areas controlled by the British Empire, ruled the territory where Kenya was limited as part of a territory which stretched from modern-day Somalia to modern-day Kenya. It also stretched westward to the land north of Lake Victoria. This was from 1888 to 1895, when the company went defunct. Kenyatta's father died at a very early age, prompting the remarriage of his mother to his father's younger brother, who was referred to as Ngengi. Kenyatta and his younger brother, referred to as Kungu, took up the name of his new father. Kenyatta became known as Kamau Wangengi, while his brother became known as Kungu Wangengi. This family underwent domestic abuse from Gengi due to strains caused by the polygamous nature of the marriage. Kenyatta's mother went back to her father's homestead. When his mother died, Kenyatta traveled northwards and took his infant brother and went to live with him at his grandfather's house. And his brothers opted to live with his grandfather, Kungu Wamagana, who practiced traditional medicine. He inculcated the skills and knowledge of herbalism to Kenyatta. May partly explain why Kenyatta, during his presidency, was fond of medicinal gardens. Professor Ocheng, who was once the Dean of Faculty of Forestry at Moi University and who at one time was the conservator of forests in Kenya, took part in many projects of introducing medicinal plants at Kenyatta's home at Ichaweri in Gatundu and in the very many state houses in Kenya. Professor Cheng spoke passionately about the carefully and elaborately implemented work of introducing and managing various plants, species, many of which were selected by Kenyatta himself. Mrs. Mumbi Madoka, who was in charge of protocol at State House, stated in her memoirs that Kenyatta was in touch with nature. He introduced many plant species and flowers with deep meaning at State House, thanks to his grandfather, Kungu Wamagana, who imparted this knowledge and skill. Perhaps it was the establishment of a new mission at Thogoto that was to transform Kenyatta's life forever. The missioner was referred to as Reverend Watson and his wife, called Minnie Watson. They came to Thogoto in 1898. Watson managed to get 30 acres of land from the son of Chief Waiyaki to establish a mission. This time, many people died from smallpox as a result of ongoing epidemic. It was at the mission where many came to find comfort and healing. The missionaries came with supplies of medical services and used them as an opportunity to evangelize the local population. Established a prefabricated chapel with materials that were shipped from Scotland. In 1907, they opened a school to provide basic education to local students. Who was then referred to as Kamau Wangengi from Ichaweri, was admitted at the Thogoto School in 1909, coinciding with the first colonial policy on education in Kenya called the Fraser Report. A detailed account of Kenyatta's admission to the school was given by Reverend Musa Gitau, who was among the first church ministers of the Presbyterian Church. Reverend Musa Gitau was the father of Mrs. Matiba and Mrs. Waithaka, who was the first African headmistress of Alliance High School. Reverend Musa Gitau played a critical part in inspiring Kenyatta to seek for education. According to Reverend Gitau, he stated that Kenyatta came to the school when he was admitted at the hospital, Thogoto, in 1909, the year that the hospital at Thogoto became operational. Problem with both his feet and one leg, therefore had to undergo surgery. His foot and leg problem was never properly explained, even in later life. It was noted that Kenyatta walked with a limp. Njiru, who was a press secretary, stated that Kenyatta was suffering from gout. It should be noted that Kenyatta loved meat and he loved to drink a lot of soup, a culture that he had established at his Ichaweri home. Later, of course, he had problems with his doctors, principally Dr. Njoroge Mungai, for loving too much meat. In the 1960s, there was a talk about a blood clot and strokes that Kenyatta suffered from. References stated that it was more to do with the nerve problem. His interest in education, Kenyatta entered the Thogoto school in 1909 and started classes which included carpentry classes, studied English and mathematics. This must have been an early form of competency-based curriculum where skills were incorporated in the education system. It was also during this time that Kenyatta started catechism course at the mission. It was also during this time that he worked as a gardener and a houseboy for the White family. Completed his studies in 1912 and became an apprenticed carpenter. His attempts to train in masonry was rejected. In 1913, Kenyatta underwent the Kikuyu rite of passage. In August 1914, Kenyatta, then referred to as Kamau Wangengi, was baptized at the Church of Scotland. He was asked to choose a name. He chose two names, John and Peter. He was asked to pick only one. He ended up with the name Johnstone Kamau. The part of stone was in reference to Peter, who was the stone and bedrock of the Christian church. He then departed the mission for Nairobi to look for employment. He got a job as an apprentice carpenter on a sisal farm in Thika, under the tutelage of one John Cook, who had been in charge of the building program at the Thogoto mission. It was during this time that World War I broke out. It involved the mobilization of 140,000 Kenyans. His own brother, Kungu, was conscripted into the army. According to Reverend Musa Gitau, Africans were conscripted and told that their countries or ethnic regions risked subjugation by the Germans. One brother Kungu was among the 40,000 Kenyans who never returned or died in the battlefield. In order to escape conscription to the army, Kenyatta moved to Narok, where one of his aunties was married to a Maasai chief. He lived among the Maasais and worked as a clerk, nation contractor. During his stay in Narok, he took to wearing a traditional beaded belt known as Kenyatta, a Swahili word meaning light of Kenya. He survived the Spanish influenza of 1918 and 19, which killed 150,000 people in Kenya and more than 70 million people worldwide. In 1919, he met and married his first wife, Grace Wahu. His marriage in a traditional ceremony was opposed by the missionaries. He had to undergo a mandatory civil ceremony in November 1922. In the same year, 1922, he adopted the name Jomo, meaning burning spear. To his exposure and the fact that he could communicate well in English, Kenyatta gained prominence The Kikuyu Central Association, which was formed by James Buter and Joseph Kang'ethe. He worked as an editor of the journal called Bwiguthania, formed between 1924 and 1928. Later, he became the Secretary General of the Kikuyu Central Association. As I finalize this edition, I would like to say that my highlights are on the early part of Kenyatta's life and how it influenced his future life and the fact that he came to rule the nation of Kenya. The following points are very, very critical. These ones are as follows. Kenyatta was among the first persons to benefit from the colonial education policy, which was called Fraser Report, which was launched in 1909. It emphasized separate education for Asians, Europeans, and Africans. It also recommended that African education should be concentrated on technical and vocational skills. This separate education policy was later done away with in independent Kenya. His exposure to the English language enabled him to represent Kikuyu interests abroad. This brought him into prominence during Kenya's struggle for independence. The opportunity of studying in Moscow and later London School of Economics under Professor Malinowski. Studying in Eastern Europe and in Western Europe, it exposed him to capitalistic and communistic theories and enabled him to come up on a brand of African socialism in Kenya, referred to as Sessional Paper Number 10 of 1964. While he was abroad, he gained skills in international politics when he interacted with the Caribbean and African advocates of freedom who were advocating for reforms in colonial programs. These included Haile Selassie, Kwame Nkrumah, George Padmo, Ras McConnell, and others. It should also be noted that Kenyatta, while in Thogoto and Narok, survived, smallpox and Spanish flu that killed hundreds of thousands of Africans. Another aspect to observe is that Kenyatta's dressing etiquette changed forever. Arrived in Thogoto barefoot, but left with some black shoes, tweed jacket and tie. He started wearing a Mexican hat, started wearing formal suits. Not only he wore a traditional attire, a jacket, in addition to kitenge shirts. Another observation made was that his name changed 5 times, from being called Kamau Muigai to Jomo Kenyatta. Something dramatic was that Kenyatta soon afterwards fell out with the Presbyterian Church. He refused to participate in activities aimed at campaigning against female genital mutilation led by Dr. Arthur and the missionaries at Thogoto. He was excommunicated from the church for marrying Wahu in a traditional ceremony held in 1919. Wahu's marriage was a series of 4 other marriages that Kenyatta had in the course of his life, never formally allowed back to the Presbyterian Church. Kenyatta's children initially attended Sunday school at All Saints Cathedral, which is an Anglican church, perhaps due to Mrs. Mumbi's Doka, who was in charge of their upkeep. Due to the influence of Father Muhoho, who was Mangina's brother, they started attending the Consolata Church. Partly explains Uhuru's confession of Catholicism. Jomo Kenyatta went into coma in 1968, and it was assumed that he was at point of death. The funeral organizing committee planned to bury him at St. Andrew's Church in Nairobi. But when he died in 1978, the burial ground had changed to Parliament grounds, and the funeral was interreligious in nature. If you think you have learned something on this journey, kindly subscribe, comment, and give a like.